Chapter 13. The recorded datasphere of Nico Arata, as experienced by Clayton Marcells. 2026 of the Ghost World Calendar. Long ago, the Raven had found a world, and there settled for a time. Its energy infused that world until the very natural order had been shifted to align itself with the Raven's power. Just as all old gods are forgotten, so was the Raven. It became a thing of myth, buried in the endless belief systems produced by 1,000 human populations. Although evidence of its power existed all around them, they had rationalized the entity into folklore. In this world, it was known that the dead can walk side by side with the living. Almost every human possessed at least the psychic faculty to notice the ever-present spirits of the deceased among them. Science had theorized that they were electromagnetic recordings or projections of repressed human consciousness. However, everyone was aware of their presence, and everyone could see them. Human civilization developed side by side with its dead, and their influence could be seen in every aspect of the modern world. There were specialists who dealt primarily with interactions with the dead, and researchers whose profession was the analysis of hauntings and ghostly encounters. The existence of the spirits was marginalized and commercialized. People paid to witness the destructive actions of poltergeists and the reenactments of disturbing violent deaths at haunted locales. There were places which were the paranormal equivalent of a brothel, where patrons could interact with specters that were locked in states of ongoing lustful activities. Here lay a frightening fact. In this world, the strange, little understood energy which pervaded allowed the ghosts to interact on a level unknown in many other worlds. And for this reason, the ghosts did not leave or reincarnate. This world had become a playground for the dead, and no one even knew enough to question why. Aside from this, the world had advanced in much the same way as others. There were cars, computers, malls, and wildlife conservation areas. The normal, mundane routines of everyday life were in full practice as people were born and lived out lifetimes working jobs and raising families. However, on the cusp of every routine existence was the presence of the dead, no matter how each individual chose to rationalize them. Some ignored them, some feared them, and still others paid tribute in ceremony and religion. They were fascinating, frightening, and commonplace all at once. Every man, woman, and child had to deal with at least a doubtful fear that eventually they would join the ranks of the spirits. It was clear that the state of death was much different than that of life. The ghosts were not altogether happy or enlightened. Most were lost in a seemingly everlasting series of dreams, which could be both euphoric and nightmarish. The presence of the dead in their everyday lives did not make for any lack in terror of death for the people of this world, but instead served only to reinforce it. There were departments at every college where debates raged endlessly over the philosophical implications of the ghostly existence. It was determined that at least some of the dead did not enter into this state, or at least they were not visible and documented. Communications with the deceased only further served to exacerbate the quandaries of the living, as the ghosts themselves seemed to have little or no idea of what the purpose of this quasi-existence could possibly be. There were various religions that claimed to offer answers. One such faith dictated that by fulfilling whatever unfinished business the apparition had on our earthly plane, the said ghost could move on. However, in practice, these techniques proved to be fruitless, as every ghost presented an endless list of things which could be considered unfinished. Any given human being leaves their life with a host of tasks and ambitions, and narrowing this list down to one cornerstone desire was undoubtedly impossible. It was found that the psychology of each spirit was as varied and unique as the human personality which had generated it. In general, it was accepted that when you passed from the mortal coil, there was a very reasonable chance, at least 1 in 10, that you would simply cross over into the bizarre and somewhat inconceivably confused state of ghostliness. As for the others, one school of thought hypothesized that others were present but undetectable, while the other school claimed the rest had somehow moved on. It became a long-running goal amongst the learned members of philosophy, science, and religion to determine what circumstances entailed transcendence from the ghostly state into some higher plane. How can a spirit move on? Members of some cultures took a more grounded day-to-day approach of just trying to live in acceptance of the spirits and try to make their afterlife as comfortable as possible in the hopes that someone would do the same for them. This was a predominating aspect of many Eastern cultures that honored the deceased with temples, shrines, and marked spaces on the calendar considered sacred to the dead. The Chinese held the 7th lunar month around August and September as a period set aside for the acknowledgement and tribute for the deceased. In European and other Western cultures, the time was set in October, during which events ranging from celebration to ceremony were conducted in honor of the departed. Such traditions included costumed parties where drinks were poured and food served for the spirits, to candlelight vigils at churches and temples where prayers were aimed at releasing the earthly bound dead into higher states of being. Religion itself contained a quality of uncertainty, but nonetheless persevered as the only recognizable source of hope for the denizens of the strange earthly purgatory. This profound awareness of the realities of death held sway over many aspects of the earthly world. War was an even more terrifying prospect, as it assuredly yielded vast numbers of bitter, restless souls that could easily wreak havoc on society and economy in countless destructive ways. Even to date, there were spirits still present from conflicts which had long ended centuries ago, enraged over the circumstances which had forced them into an early loss of their precious human lives. But still, the weaknesses and corruptions of man's nature continued, even under the influence of the echoes left by past mistakes. Crime existed and thrived, as in all of man's dominions. Although actions leading to murder were rare, crimes of lust and greed still managed to be prevalent. Desire could always find those willing to partake in illicit affairs, and even with the visible weight of a justice so intrusive, there will always be those willing to kill. Society, however, was much less inclined to punish murder with death, as it would irrevocably only create a vengeful apparition to tolerate. Therapy and rehabilitation were mainstays in most modern societies, with the hope of at least eventually having a more reasonable ghost with which to deal. In 2025, reports began flooding into every news network and parapsychology department in the United States that a vortex was growing near a small town in Mississippi called Mossboro. To the innately sensitive people of this reality, the vortex was visible as a whirling distortion that flashed in and out of visibility at strange intervals. Drawing the attention of the international media proved lucrative to the tourist industry of the area, as investigators and random sightseers flocked to the southern states in order to view the phenomenon. For an entire year, the woods and coastal beaches became residents of impromptu campsites as people attempted to document and record all experiences associated with this storm. Although regular cameras could capture nothing of the actual body of the vortex, the area itself had become a hotbed of supernatural activity. Witnesses reported lapses of missing time, spectral phenomena, and an electromagnetic field that rendered most electronic devices useless within a circumference of 2 miles. There was power outages reported as far away as Jackson, and the event became viewed by many as a psychic hurricane. It was near the end of 2026 when Nico Arata arrived in Atlanta, Georgia from Tokyo, Japan on a carryover flight to Biloxi, Mississippi. She and her group of college friends were informed that the flight was delayed due to the upsets in plane navigation caused by the ongoing disturbance in Mississippi. Deciding that a road trip would be fun, they rented a van and set off, their destination, the very disturbance in question. Nico, or Kat to her English-speaking friends, was none other than the daughter of the infamous Yakuza Oyobun, Kino Arata, current Kumicho, or boss of the Takaya Yakuza, operating out of Kobe, Japan. Nico's mother was Japanese, born South Korean, and her father, Birakuman, a class of Japanese citizen long held in disdain due to its association with jobs and actions considered unclean by the Shinto faith. Kino's nickname amongst the crime syndicate was the Embalmer, due to this being the trade practiced by his family for generations. Kino was known for his near obsession with honor and respectful adherence to the treatment of the deceased. His headquarters was currently still a working coroner's office, complete with shrine to the spirits of the city. His mindfulness of the spirit world, combined with Nico's ancestral link to the spirit world due to her great-grandmother's role as a Korean wudang, or shaman, had influenced the girl since childhood. She had been seeking a degree in paranormal studies in Saitama when she had first learned of the vortex. It became her goal to visit the site of the phenomenon, and after many requests and outright begging, her father had afforded her the trip. The journey through the American South proved enjoyable as they stuffed themselves at roadside diners and gleefully photographed the spirits of Confederate and Union soldiers, which could be seen wandering the fields and farmhouses near historical battlegrounds at night. But Nico's insistence on adhering to a set schedule kept them traveling non-stop, as word had reached the media that it seemed the vortex was closing. Finding the actual anomaly was simple, as the sky over the area was cast in a continuous violet haze which darkened the countryside and gave an eerie radiance at night. Mossboro, although originally only a small township, had become a bustling tourist trap, full of gift shops peddling every manner of vortex memorabilia, all the way from t-shirts to books describing the various experiences of travelers in the area. Nico and her 4 friends departed just such a shop, with shirts declaring, "I saw the vortex," over the image of a great swirling purple maelstrom. They rented rooms at a local bed and breakfast before their first journey down the long trail to the lake that was seemingly the eye of the paranormal storm. As they hiked, they talked excitedly of the various theories launched over the past year as to the meaning and origin of the vortex. It had been said that this was a gateway opened to a higher plane for many of the ghosts willing to cross over. As a point of reinforcement to the theory, many apparitions had seemed to congregate in what the Japanese called Shudan Bora, or groups of apparitions around the area as if drawn magnetically. Nico's group saw many of such spirits wandering towards the lake through the woods in white glowing translucent bands of as many as 20. Of course, apocalypse rumors abounded as they always had, but now that the anomaly was in recession, it seemed much less likely to bring about certain doom to the world at large. Standing triumphantly at the shore of the lake, Nico gazed upon the remnant of the original vast temporal disturbance with wonder. At times the sky was empty but for dark whirling clouds, but in a flash like lightning, one could view a bright violet center, like a glowing amethyst stone in the water at the center of the pool. In these flashes, it seemed as if a wall of light would appear around them, causing the hair on their arms and necks to stand upright, as if affected by a static occurrence. The lake was surrounded by people with cameras and equipment that seemed comfortable and entertained, as if viewing a particularly good fireworks display. It was Nico who first noticed the presence of large, dark birds perched in great numbers in the moss-covered trees in the woods. She had read that the birds were thought to have been drawn to the electromagnetic field, which was disturbing their natural sense of direction. However, as she zoomed in on them with her camera and snapped pictures, she began to develop a curiosity concerning their presence. Wildlife did not seem to be unduly affected by the vortex, and even now, ducks could be viewed paddling along the shore of the lake as if nothing were amiss. She watched as other birds flew over the water and near the core of the disturbance, but noticed with fascination that the ravens seemed to be flying higher than the others. She watched as several seemed to be abruptly disappearing high over the lake and then reappearing before flying back down to the sitting flocks nearby. Researchers had explained the phenomenon as an illusion caused by the birds vanishing into the perceptual fog near the center, but Nico began to wonder otherwise. When she returned to her room that night, she began loading the images from her camera into her laptop and examining the pictures more closely. She excitedly called her friend Kichan from a deep sleep to show her that she was convinced to be photographic proof that the birds were coming from the vortex. Nico's discovery was largely disregarded by her friends, but an idea began to emerge in Nico's mind, which only evolved over the course of her stay. After a heated online video chat with her father, she managed to convince him to allow her another week and more money to watch what was now thought to be the closing of the anomaly. It was late in the day during the following week that the storm had passed, and all that remained was an occasional violet flicker of light the size of a light bulb in the depths of the lake. Diving teams reported that the spot originated at the very bottom of the lake, and a sigh of disappointment for some and gratitude for others was exhaled when it was finally announced that the temporal disturbance was at an end. The sightseers began to depart the next day, and only the few remaining National Guard were left to observe the site and watch over government scientists who were still recording data of the aftermath. Nico noticed that there were still large numbers of ravens circling the area. Sadly for Nico and her group, it was time to return home. Upon her return, Nico was under direct orders to meet with her father and answer for her disrespectful behavior during her sabbatical. She found herself weary and jet-lagged walking down the crowded city street to her father's business headquarters in Kobe. It was in times like this that she wished her mother was still alive to calm her father's wrath, but only her spirit remained, wandering the garden of her father's home, never speaking, just staring blankly at the flowers and the trees she had cherished in life. She entered and was greeted by Kaino's secretary at the front desk and told that her father was in conference. Smiling, she walked down the long hallway and entered an elevator which would take her to the basement. In Japan, the Yakuza operated in full view of the public, and mixed feelings concerning their presence had existed since the birth of their organization. Nico's father was above all else a businessman, and his continued support of the local community had kept him in high regard, for the most part, amongst the citizens of Japan in general. The Yakuza existed as a complex ruling body of organized crime, but at the same time managed to provide a sense of security in a world where crime was usually chaotic and uncontrolled. They had provided community aid in events such as earthquakes and tsunamis faster than any government groups, and their presence ensured that freelance violent criminals were kept in a minimum when law enforcement could not. Arata Embalming operated as an open, two-sided business, and Kaino's number one rule was, respect the dead. However, being the daughter of a Yakuza boss was not an honored position in Japanese society, and Nico had done her best to keep her family's business as low profile as possible. She had known about her father's affiliations since her early teens, but this did not change her vision of him as being basically an honorable man. The Yakuza saw themselves as outsiders from the mainstream world of Japanese tradition, and this attitude had greatly affected the development of her identity over the years. Nico followed her intuition, and this strong unconscious sense was compelling her to discuss her ideas concerning the vortex with her father, despite the obvious absurdity of the subject. As far as Japanese fathers went, Kaino was lenient and somewhat patronizing of her interests, but he was also a prideful and stubborn man who had little patience for matters he considered frivolous. As she stepped from the elevator and into the sub-basement, she continuously reviewed her strategy and how to engage her father's interest. As she walked through the darkness towards the table in the center of the open area, she simply resolved herself to hope that he was in a listening mood. Unfortunately, she had already angered him with her disrespect during their last conversation and could hope for little more than reprimand now. He was playing cards with several local bosses and advisors. As was customary, they were shirtless to reveal the ornate, colorful, full-body tattoos which adorned almost every inch of their flesh that could be covered by clothing. Here, in private, these symbols of tradition and fealty could be shown with pride amongst other Yakuza members. She waited in the shadows unannounced and awaited the game to end. She listened as they discussed everything from business to sporting events and distracted herself by wandering to the utility rooms in the back. There, as she had hoped, was the ghost of her great-uncle Fujinara, as he inspected several shelves of embalming equipment with careful, calculating eyes. Fujinara, like many specters, was stricken with an almost OCD-like focus, his attention being mostly concerned with inventorying the stock of the utility rooms. She caught his gaze momentarily, and she bowed respectfully as a quick smile passed over his lips and he continued his counting and categorizing. Fujinara was somewhat lucid in comparison with many ghosts, and was even known to speak to the living. But this usually consisted of a scalding if the items were not carefully replaced in their proper spot. She studied him and tried to understand exactly what his existence must be like here in the office, counting and recounting, organizing and filing. She wondered if the routine was a mechanism of denial, or an actual compulsion of some karmic influence. Many spirits that were more aware of the living world grew angry and deranged with frustration. Her father had commanded subordinates to treat Fujinara as if he were a living employer, just as he had Nico's mother when she appeared in the garden at home. This was Kaino's way to preserve the sanctity of his relationships with the departed. He was known to visit the garden any time his wife was seen and walk with her as she inspected the flowers. He presented her with anniversary and birthday gifts on the appropriate dates and would inform her of Nico's progress in school. He never remarried and was not known to keep any mistress. Nico heard the scrape of chairs and parting words as the game ended. It was time to face her father. When she came around the corner, he was pulling on his coat and acknowledged her only with a smile eerily reminiscent of Fujinara's. She lowered her eyes and folded her hands demurely before her as she followed him to the elevator. After the others had gone up, they entered together as he pressed the button for the second floor. "So, Was your journey worth the expense? He said without emotion, his eyes fixed on the doors. Never being one for subterfuge, Nico immediately blurted, "There is something I must tell you, Father." Her excitement did not chip the cold shell of his demeanor. "That you humbly apologized for the brazen way you spoke to your father?" He responded with a sideways glance. "Well, yes, that and something else," she said, trying desperately to think of some way to engage his interest. "You have disappointed me with your actions over this past year, and I am considering a large cut in your allowance." She winced at the thought of having to take a job on top of her studies, but her intuition refused to allow her to stop the rush of words threatening to erupt from her lips. "Father, do you remember Mother speaking of Yata Garsu?" He paused in silence and stared at her with a look that floundered between indignant anger and curiosity. "I have no time for this. Are you truly wishing to compound your transgressions with this nonsense?" "Yatagasu was the three-legged raven that guided Emperor Jimu. Yes, I remember the story. But what do you hope to gain by letting your mouth run away with you, Nico?" The elevator doors opened, and Nico quickly composed herself, knowing that showing any sign of disrespect to her father before his staff would prove fatal to her ambition. She followed him silently down the hall as he walked to his office. They entered, and he closed the door before seating himself calmly at his desk and scrutinizing her with piercing brown eyes. "Have you completely taken leave of your senses?" His anger was simmering low and boiling beneath his composed exterior. "From what I understand, this vortex of yours has closed, and yet you insist on continuing to annoy me with this nonsense." "That's just it. I don't think it's really closed. The birds that were lingering in the area are not indigenous to that region, and I witnessed them flying in and out of the field of the vortex." "Yes, and exactly what does that mean?" he said, exhausted and beaten. "These ravens are still there, and if I'm right, they came from the vortex. I have checked the photographs I took while in Mississippi, and those birds are not just typical ravens. They are far too large, and I am positive that their eyes possessed a violet discoloration." "What is your point, Nico?" "I have several. I am not the only one interested in the vortex. Really. And who else shares your obsession with this thing?" "Yamashita Enterprises." She pronounced the words slowly for effect. "And what do you know of Yamashita?" he said, sitting up slightly in his chair as if suddenly uncomfortable. "I know that they are associates of yours, and that they are working in the field of paranormal technology." She sat down across from him as if preparing for a job interview. "And what if they are? They have recently acquired an American company called Albright Incorporated and are looking for a place to build an industrial complex." "Yes, it is all common knowledge. But what does it have to do with this anomaly?" "I think you should convince the Yamashita shareholders to buy the land in Mississippi and build their complex there." "For what purpose?" He was truly exasperated now, but he had to admit she was definitely leading him somewhere. "I think that with the technology that Yamashita is currently working on, that they can reopen the vortex under controlled conditions and study its nature. Father, this could be the biggest discovery of the new millennia." "But for what purpose? What do you think can be accomplished with this plan?" His voice was now even calm and deadly serious as he folded his hands on the desk before him. "I think it might be a way to free the dead." Her words carried the weight of a crushing blow. Is it even possible? The dead were drawn to it by the thousands. I saw it with my own eyes. But many did not enter. I think it was out of fear of the unknown, but there was an energy present that drew them in, and it was documented that in the presence of the brief flashes of this energy, their ability to communicate and interact with the physical world were increased. I believe that there is a direct line of connection between the vortex, the ravens, and the ghosts of our world. It might lead to the answer as to why so many of the dead are trapped here, and where the ones that do move on go. Kano looked at his daughter with intense wonder, but the ring of truth laced every word she had said. She had laid a path out before him, and all there was for him to do was to follow it. To release the dead would be the greatest thing he could imagine doing. For mankind to finally be able to dream of an afterlife other than wandering in a vast limbo of dream and nightmare, this would be the greatest gift he could give to the world. He knew that he and a few of his men would be attending the next Yamashita board meeting. Kaino had anticipated reluctance among the shareholders and came prepared to place heavy pressure for his suggestions if need be. However, he found the board members not only interested, but eager to initiate the plan. Nico had assured him that the vortex was of immense interest to everyone with any affiliations with science and physics, but he was shocked to hear much of what Nico had said echoed in the boardroom. He did take note that the subject of the strange species of raven was not brought up, and indeed seemed to be Nico's personal observation. He had studied her photographs of the birds for himself, and had reached the same conclusion most of the witnesses had. They were birds drawn to the vortex, although he was forced to agree that they were large, and did seem to have a purple reflective color to their eyes. He had rationalized that this was simply due to the reflection of the luminescence produced by the vortex. After the meeting was over, he had met Nico, who waited in the car with bated breaths as to the results, and he watched as she nearly exploded with excitement at the unfolding of her plan. Unbeknownst to Kaino, he had unwittingly been the catalyst for the dawning of a new age in their world's history, the birth of ghostlight technology. Chapter 14. The recorded datasphere of Nico Arata as experienced by Clayton Marcells. 2035 of the Ghost World Calendar. The purchase of the land in Mississippi was the first step, and in turn proved to be a difficult process. First, establishing who even actually owned the property was a lengthy task, and then, after identifying the owners, negotiating its sale proved troublesome. The land was the joint property of a nearby farmer who had originally been on the verge of selling out to timber development, and a wealthy Biloxi businessman who used the area for hunting and fishing. Unfortunately, since the vortex had turned the entire Mossboro area into one of the most popular campgrounds in the South, Yamashita waited patiently as enthusiasm for the vortex site gradually wore down before beginning a steadily rising series of offers to the landowners. During the 3 years it took for the acquisition to occur, Nico had continued to study the area and make notes concerning her thoughts on the ravens and anomaly, which she passed on to the Yamashita via her father. After the buyout, the first event on Albright's list was the draining of the lake and the construction of a research facility directly over the vortex epicenter. After another year of development, it was discovered by Yamashita physicists and engineers that Nika had been correct, and on a subatomic level, there did still remain the pinpoint remnant of a wormhole. Even more astonishingly, it was producing an energy field that could be barely registered on their available instruments. In time, however, a unique particle accelerator was created, which increased the readable output of the wormhole's radioactive field, and so was created the prototype of GSG, the original Ghost Light Generator. It was determined that the charged particles radiating from the anomaly were possessed of the same basic qualities as light waves. They could be reflected, transmitted, and used at varying levels of intensity. However, the property of these particles when affecting existing particle fields was the true breakthrough. Albright Incorporated was on the verge of discovering the secret of ghostly materialization on a subatomic level. Unfortunately, research funding was cut as Yamashita began the push for finding a marketable means of earning profit from the project, and results began to mean more than understanding. What they knew was that the energy was as easily transmittable as sound waves, but by means of their accelerator could be reproduced in any locale in lightwave form. Therefore, a portable version of the Ghost Light accelerator that doubled as an emissions receiver was not only possible, but already made, at least in prototype form. They also knew that ghosts were not only drawn to the radiation, but had altered properties while within the glow. They became more lucid, aware, and capable of physical interaction with the material plane. To the delight of Yamashita's development team, the radiance was also found to have other peculiar properties. And although there was very little understood about how Ghost Light did what it did, Yamashita was eager to market it. By this time, almost 10 years had passed since the original vortex had been seen, and Nico Arata had graduated with honors and through her father's influence gained an entry-level position on the Ghost Light research team. Quickly establishing herself as an ingenious lab technician, she was soon promoted to lead research assistant, and a year following as head researcher. It was under her supervision that it was first discovered that by alternating particle waves within the core accelerator, that the properties of ghost light could be altered to produce different effects. It was her theory that the spirits of the dead were existing in a stasis field, and by accessing this field, past events preserved in particle formations could be observed. Also true to her word, she discovered that the means by which the dead could not only be drawn to the ghost light, but contained within it and transferred to another state. Effectively, Yamashita Enterprises had created and patented the first device capable of ridding the world of unwanted ghosts. The only question being, where did they go? Not that Yamashita would let such petty quandaries stop them from producing and selling the devices on the open market. However, there were many among the general public who were disturbed by Yamashita's lack of concern regarding the fate of the displaced revenants. One of whom, not surprisingly, was Kaino Arata. Kaino was now older and facing his own mortality with the realization that should he return as an apparition, the device his own daughter had helped create might send him off to some unknown fate. From what we can tell, it destabilizes the particle field, thereby allowing the ghostly form to disperse, Nico explained to her father's face, which stared back at her from the screen of her home computer. But where do they go? His voice was cold. Kaino's disappointment in her dismissive attitude was obvious. Somewhere else, she answered, exasperated by having to have the same discussion again so soon in the week. And when I am a spirit, you will disperse me to somewhere else. His voice dripped with angry sarcasm. That was the point of the entire project, Father. What would you prefer, to be like Great Uncle Fujinara? Wandering the basement, taking inventory for an eternity? The look in her father's eyes was enough to make her feel like a spoiled, disrespectful child. But she could not stand having this conversation again. I have to go, Father, she lied. I will speak to you soon. He shook his head in disgust, and soon her screen had returned to the screensaver, a large image of the vortex, the logo for Ghostlight Technologies. She felt drained and frustrated. Nico had devoted herself completely to the mystery of the vortex, and in turn had watched the technology spawned by its discovery spin into a juggernaut. She looked at the time in the corner of the monitor and decided she couldn't spend the next few hours sitting alone in her house working until she fell asleep at her desk. She slipped on her shoes and grabbed her car keys from the bowl beside the door. She needed a drink. Mossborough's transformation from town into a tourist destination had continued its evolution further with the building of the Ghostlight complex. Mossborough was now a thriving company town, which housed the majority of the complex employees. The town had developed a thriving nightlife, complete with restaurants, bars, and dance clubs. Nico entered the bar and grill known as the Vortex after nodding innocuously to the bouncer at the door. She found herself a corner booth where she ordered a whiskey sour and a plate of shrimp. Most tables were empty, only a few evening shift employees were gathered at the bar. She removed her laptop from her bag along with a pack of cigarettes and lit one as she waited for a computer to connect. She had only taken one deep drag when she saw a woman across the bar that seemed to be blatantly staring at her through large, shining black-lensed goggles. She was dressed in a deep purple halter-top corset, bound tightly enough to thrust her large breasts out in proud display. She was about Nico's height, but with broader shoulders and wide, swinging hips covered in leather pants and thigh-high black stiletto-heeled boots. Her pale white shoulders and arms were covered in various tattoos that ranged from charming to the disturbing. The woman's hair was a curly mass of wild golden blonde which bounced as she walked around the tables, a glass of vodka tonic held in the long black-nailed fingers of her right hand. Nico had no idea how to react when the woman stopped cold in front of her table and gazed at her silently with auto-rotating lenses of her goggles slowly spinning to a stop. "Hi," the woman said cheerfully. Nico looked up from her laptop and smiled politely. "Hello. You work for the Ghostlight, don't you?" The woman's voice had an overpowering southern accent as she sat down on the side of the booth and sipped her drink. "I can tell by your badge." Nico realized that she still had her security badge pinned to her coat. "That must be so interesting." "I suppose so," Nico said, blowing out another cloud of smoke as her irritated state of mind seemed to escalate with each word from the strange girl. Her relief when the waitress brought her drink was monumental. "I'm fascinated by the whole thing. Ghostlight, the Vortex, just about anything paranormal, really." Nico nodded and tried desperately to think of some way she could make the woman depart without causing a scene. "I think it's a shame, though." "What's a shame?" Nico said before she realized she might be encouraging further unwanted conversation. "That you all are getting rid of all the ghosts. Hell, why'd you want to get rid of the most interesting things around? It's like going to a theme park and getting rid of all the rides." The woman's comment immediately brought a cold bolt of anger that tightened into a knot in Nico's stomach. "Some people don't view them as being so entertaining," Nico replied, her voice rigid and trembling. The last thing she wanted was another discussion about the Ghostlight. "Yeah, but people are so stupid about things like that, don't you think? They just want to walk around spending their money, living their life as if none of it really matters, and then complain because their existence has no meaning. That's why people don't like the ghosts, honey. Because they remind them that what they do with their life matters. That there's always a price to be paid for everything." Nico now knew she had been dealing with one of the activists protesting Ghostlight research. She had to tread lightly or risk having a heated argument in the middle of what was supposed to have been a relaxing drink. "Well, you are entitled to your opinion. I just wish we could have been here to see the Vortex. Did you ever see it? I can't really guess your age. You're so pretty." Nico was momentarily thrown by the compliment and smiled despite her feeling of anxiety. "Yes, I saw it when I was in college. For a moment, Nico remembered that she had once thought of life in much the same way as the bizarre young woman. I bet it was amazing, wasn't it? Yes, it was. I've never seen anything like it. Oh, honey, would you tell me and my old man about it? We love to hear about it from people who saw it. Before she could protest, the woman had turned and called out to a small group that was standing near the bar, laughing loudly. "Dee, get over here. Bring a bottle," the woman shouted. Nico watched as the group parted, and a tall, thin young man in a long leather duster and goggles like the woman appeared holding a cup of coffee in one hand and a bottle of scotch in the other. His face was angular and hawk-like, with a high forehead, bordered with jet black tufts of unruly hair. As he approached, Nico immediately felt as if her anxiety was melting away beneath a calming wave of warm delight. It was almost as if she had suddenly been administered a sedative that was quickly turning her annoyance into a disturbing memory. "I am so sorry, dear. This is my boyfriend, Dee, and my name is Shaden, but everybody calls me Shay." "My name is Nico," she said, almost blushing as the man sat down and kissed the woman on the cheek. "Hallo," the man said with a strong German accent. "Oh, he's German, sweetie. I love the way he talks. It's so sexy." "She saw the vortex," Shay said, grabbing the man's arm excitedly. Nico could not see the expression of his eyes, but a broad smile spread across his face. "You must tell us about it then, Frau Nico." She watched as he refilled her glass from the bottle, and despite her reservations about the two strangers, Nico found herself downing nearly half the tumbler in one swallow. As the pleasant heat filled her stomach and spread out through her arms and legs, she began a long account of her experience with the vortex. Shay and Dee were an enrapt audience, and interrupted only occasionally to proclaim their jealousy at not being present at the historical event. The waitress brought her platter of shrimp, which she shared with the two new acquaintances, and the evening flew by in a whirl of laughter and conversation like Nico had not experienced in years. After she was too intoxicated and weary to continue, Shay asked for her keys and called her a cab on her cell phone. But what about my car?" she had mumbled as they carried her between them to the parking lot. "Just tell us your address, sweetie, and Dee will drive it there. I'll ride with you in the cab," Shay had said patiently as her strange goggles turned soundlessly. You guys are so nice," she had slurred, giggling. She had then managed to give her address before falling into a deep, alcohol-induced slumber. All she would remember the next day, when awakening late from work, was Shay sitting calmly beside her in the cab, and a dream that ravens were perched in the trees outside her house as she was being carried to the door. Chapter 15. The Journal of Clayton Marcells, October 29th, 2049. I had been completely submerged in the strange translation of data that had unfolded within my mind. I had not just witnessed the recorded experiences as a series of descriptions, but had existed within the events as an unseen observer. As if in a dream, my unconscious was incapable of questioning or analyzing the events from some outside point. I had been one with the information as it bloomed from the datasphere like a flower of perception. But as I had drifted deeper into the core of events, I had begun to feel a pull from above, akin to some reversal of gravity, dragging me skyward until I was absorbed in an ocean of blackness. I had snapped awake in a quick jolt and shot upright in the tub as if an electrical appliance had been plunged into the water beside me. Overwhelmed with existential shock, I ripped the mask from my eyes and was immediately blinded by the presence of purple illumination all around me. My naked body fell into spasms in the freezing water as my eyes struggled to readjust to the luminescence which flooded my vision. With stiff, numb fingers, I grasped at the edges of the tub and pulled myself up, only to find my legs quivering and without the strength to support me. I fell onto the floor, lying shivering and fetal as I fought to understand what was occurring. How long had I lain unconscious in the bathroom? And why had no one awakened or removed me? A few hours was all I was supposed to have spent in the unconscious state, and yet by the condition of my withered and starving body, I would have guessed days might have passed. The bathroom was as it had been, but for the peculiar, oh-so-familiar purple-blue light that seemed to completely dominate the visible light spectrum. What had happened? Where was Angelica and the others? Had Yamashita somehow located us? Why had they left me laying there in the water? It was then, as my eyes began to clear and focus, that I saw the door of the bathroom open with a groan on its old, rusty hinges. I looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, bathed in the omnipresent violet glow. The urge to cry out was stifled only by my sickened and vulnerable physicality as Neil Kenny stood before me with his head tilted sideways to meet my gaze. "Mr. Mercels," he said, and for the first time I heard his voice so calm and professional. "I see you finally woke up. I'm so very pleased. I was beginning to wonder if you were going to stew in your filth forever." He laughed slightly and slapped my face twice with a long hand. "You really went in deep, didn't you, buddy?" He grabbed my arms and lifted me from the floor and sat me like a sick child on the stool where Angelica had been the last time I'd seen her. What's going on?" I mumbled through my chattering teeth as I shook violently in the cold, almost epileptic convulsions. "I would think that would be obvious, Mr. Mercels. You're dead." He was grinning sadistically as he thumped my shoulder with false compassion. "You shouldn't have been tampering with things you don't understand." I watched as he reached inside his coat and withdrew a long, gleaming butcher knife. He grabbed the back of my hair and pulled my head back, holding the blade to my throat. "Now, we get to know each other. I prefer to get acquainted with people from the inside out." In one quick slash, he pierced my stomach just above my groin and pulled the blade upward, opening my abdomen as if beginning the process of gutting an animal. He was laughing as blood spilled from my mouth and, dropping the knife to the floor, began digging in my stomach with his bare fist. He pulled out my intestines in long, bloody ropes and threw them aside as he continued grabbing and pulling with insane, ecstatic glee. I could offer no resistance as the horrible, ripping pain of his brutal attack continued until I dropped an empty shell of ribs and tissue by the tub. I should be dead, I thought, as he picked up his knife and began dragging me from the room by my twitching foot. There was no way someone could survive complete disembowelment, but my eyes were still open and watching as he took me to a room a few yards down the hallway and kicked open the door. He dragged me into the bedroom and lifted me with ease to place me upon a long metal operating table where the bed should have been. He attached my wrists and ankles to corner straps before he began enthusiastically cutting around my throat and then grabbing the flesh above my collarbones, tearing it away from my chest in long sheets. Leaning over me, he looked down into my tear-filled eyes and said, "Welcome to the Vortex, Mr. Mercels." Screaming into darkness. But quickly, soft, normal white light appeared in the utter blackness. I was in the same room as I had found myself taken in the dream, but the horrid indigo ghost light was gone. I lay in a large sleigh bed, buried in warm, soft blankets. which I had drenched in cold, profuse amounts of sweat. Angelica and Ryan were seated beside me in large, comfortable padded chairs. Angelica leaping up and grabbing my arms as I coughed, and felt the room weave in an onslaught of a crushing blast of pain in my skull. My thoughts were fragmented and distorted as I fought to discern between the images in my mind and the surroundings my senses perceived. I was grasping my throat and chest to confirm the flesh was unscathed. With unimaginable relief, my hands found my stomach whole and intact. What the hell happened? I asked as Angelica petted my hair soothingly, her deep green eyes concerned and grateful. You were in the tub, and you started seizing, so we got you out. It seemed like you didn't have a pulse for a minute, but then you were breathing normal and the seizure stopped, so we brought you in here. How do you feel? Like I just woke up from the worst nightmare I've ever had. Did it work, Clay? Did you find out anything? Ryan asked, his tone compassionate but with an underlying eagerness. Leave him alone, Ryan, Angelica said quietly, staring at my face as if seeing a glimpse of what I'd just experienced. It's okay, I said, trying to sit up, but finding the pain in my head now jetting down my spine like searing hot lead. I did see something, but none of it makes any sense. This other world, it's not just some parallel reality where things happened on a different timeline or something. It's a completely different ballgame over there. I'm not even sure if what I saw was real. What do you mean? Ryan asked, sitting on the side of the bed after calling Jesse on his cell phone to tell him I was awake. I think Jesse needs to hear this. Maybe he can help me make sense of it all. A moment after I spoke, there were footsteps in the hallway and the door opened as Jesse entered. Ryan waved him over and he sat down on the other side of the bed, and I looked at him and noticed that he was not wearing his goggles. I was momentarily shocked by the sight of his huge, dark, alien eyes, which gazed at me shining and avian. Your contacts on the other side, are they a tall man with a dark hair named D and a short, curly-haired blonde named Shay? They looked at me stunned. How did you know that? Did you see them? Jesse asked excitedly. Yeah, they were a part of it at the end. If what I experienced was real, then you guys haven't been exactly keeping me in the loop. This whole Indigo 9 thing has been bullshit from the start, hasn't it? My head felt as if claws were scraping at the inside of my cranium, but I was determined to get the truth. Angelica leaned back a moment and looked at the brothers stoically. You're right, Clay. We didn't tell you everything, but in our defense, we're not quite sure about a lot of the things ourselves. Our communication with Dee and Shay is extremely limited, and now is completely cut off. We knew that Indigo 9 was a front created by Yamashita to cover the actual source of the ghost light. Jesse sounded deeply apologetic and somewhat shameful at the confession. We just didn't know for sure. Angelica took my hand and added, I was working for Yamashita at the site, and I didn't even know for sure. Ghost light is generated by the vortex, I stated as I looked at all three of them, and I saw this was confirming their suspicion. They've kept the wormhole open and have been transmitting a version of its energy to the ghost light scanners. It's the Raven's energy, Clay. They are stealing it and using it in ways it was never meant to be used. In other worlds, a psychic can channel the power of beings like the Raven, but Yamashita is leeching it into these scanners from the vortex. How can that be? I asked, as Angelica offered me a glass of hot tea from the table. Okay, how much do you understand about our power grid? It's routed wirelessly through some kind of coil or stop right there. In the early 1900s, Nikola Tesla perfected the first wireless transmission of electricity using a 9th generation prototype of the Tesla coil. The idea being that electricity can be transferred using air or even the Earth itself as a conduit. Without this advance in technology, we would have wires strung out across the planet in every imaginable place in order to transfer electricity. Everything would require a wired power source, or at least a battery. That's crazy, man. A whole power grid based on transference by wires. I know it sounds ridiculous, but at one time, we were actually headed in that direction. However, thanks to Tesla, we found out how to send energy over distance from the generator in the form of particle waves. And this is the same way that the ghost light is functioning. All we have are theories that we were hoping you could substantiate for us. There was more, but something pulled me out of it. What? I watched as the dark, raven eyes seemed to widen into an expression of mixed interest and concern. I began to feel myself shake with the memory of my experience in the ghost light, but I forced myself to level my emotions and continue. It was as if I had awakened from the previous state, but I still wasn't here. I was present within my body, and I was connected to all physical sensations just as I am now. It at least seemed that I was completely conscious, but the dominant lighting was an emanation of indigo that radiated from no source in particular. The next thing I knew, Neil Kenny was there and butchering me like a hog while I remained completely aware. It seemed like I was lost in there for eternity. Every facet of that vision was as real as anything I have ever experienced. Within the first part, which I think was the actual data, I felt disembodied and omnipresent. But in the ghost light, I was in my body and feeling every moment of pain he inflicted on me. Did he say anything to you? Ryan asked as if in awe. He said we were in the vortex. They stared at me as if dumbfounded. Look, if what I saw before was true, then people on the other side were using ghost light to dispense all of their ghosts. I don't even understand why there were so many spirits there. I've never seen a ghost in my entire life until now. You wouldn't, Angelica said, suddenly remote as she gazed at the closed window as if remembering something troubling. The spirits of the dead linger all around us, Clay, Ryan explained, standing as he removed his goggles to reveal his own pair of dark raven eyes. These goggles do more than just hide our eyes. They are visors, so we don't always have to see what is around us. What do you mean? I asked. Ghosts, Clay, Angelica spoke wistfully and distant. The goggles keep them from seeing the apparitions of the dead which surround us. How many are there? I said, looking around the empty room. Thousands, Ryan answered in a quiet, thoughtful voice. Millions, Jesse added. They're everywhere, man. Like a fog of faces and shapes weaving in and out in a cloud of effort. That's insane, I said, suddenly feeling cold and vulnerable. It's not like that in the other world. I was remembering Nico Arata's trip through the south where the spirits had been visible, but nowhere near as dense as the accumulation which they were now describing. If everything you described is true, then our worst suspicions have been confirmed. They're sending them here through the vortex. Jesse spoke as if lost in thought. But the ghost light, why don't we see them all in the ghost light scanners? Because the particle lens used on the scanners gives off a wavelength that only reveals past events but filters out the dead. Angelica spoke as if just coming to the realization herself. They've made our world into a dumping ground for their ghosts. Ryan spoke with disbelief. You see the spirits of the dead, I said, gazing at the two brothers. I just don't get this, guys. Jesse rubbed his hand over his smooth, shaved head and gripped the back of his neck as if he seemed to be gathering his thoughts. Okay, think of it like this. A wormhole is not a black hole. It is not a void absorbing energy into a vacuum. A wormhole is a piercing in the fabric of space-time made by an incredible release of focused energy at a point where the fabric is weakened, thin, and unstable, what we call a gate or portal. Now, a single blast can open the hole, but it takes an ongoing influx of energy to hold the wormhole open. Think of the raven as a mass of wild energy that exists with its own set of special properties. It is exceptionally good at destabilizing space-time and allowing certain bound laws of physics to become blurred under its influence. 1. It creates disturbances in the dimensional wall between the states of the living and the dead. 2. It causes connectivity between present events and those past. 3. In high concentrations, it can rip holes in space-time and hold these rifts open indefinitely. This energy can be thought of as a kind of radiation, and like many forms of radiation, it can alter the DNA of biological organisms exposed to its power. Psychics, as a rule, are extremely vulnerable to these kinds of energies, and many are capable of directly channeling it. Those with conforming DNA patterns can even be permanently affected by the energy on a genetic level. In the world where we originally came from, the human race, by and large, existed at the bottom rung of the psychic totem pole. Most people may have had a very limited psychic ability, but it was not common. However, there were those from certain long-running genetic traditions who were extremely gifted and could interact with these energies on a very high level. All of us here in this house fall into that category. However, incarnating into this world has diminished us considerably. People in this world of psychically dead seem to have little or no psychic potential. Now, in the other parallel world, almost every person has been affected by the presence of the raven energy to the point of all being mid-level psychics, but with none exhibiting strong psychic characteristics. Now, it seems that although everyone was capable of experiencing ghostly phenomenon, not everyone there is able to accept it. It may be that there is some fundamental psychological mechanism in all humans which pushes us to reject the thought of existing as a disembodied entity after death. For whatever reason, many were anxious to be rid of the constant ongoing contact with the departed, while others are passionately reluctant to let it go. This brings us to ghost-like technology. They found the wormhole before it closed and built some kind of particle accelerator around it to keep it from closing. Then, not only harnessed the energy, but learned to transmit and control its functions. From what you have told us, I can only surmise that they are sending their own apparitions into the vortex, and erroneously, they are arriving here. But Neil Kenny said that he was in the vortex. Clay. In the world where we originally came from, there is a rule that was known to all psychics who were aware of ghostly phenomena. Only the dead may travel. The dead are capable of almost unlimited extra-dimensional travel while in a non-corporeal state. The only thing that stops them is the lack of knowledge concerning how. When you die, there is no introductory course on being dead, and most spirits are limited to whatever knowledge they held during life. And so spirits will reside in a state of ignorance and confusion for indeterminate lengths of time. The thing is that all it takes is for one of them to realize the possibilities of their existence. For spirits willing to forego a physical body, the options are practically unlimited. But for those longing to return to the physical world, there is reincarnation. It is entirely possible that this Neil Kenny is in fact residing within the vortex and using the ghost light scanners as a means to attack the living. But Why would he be targeting those people who work on the Ghostlight Project for Yamashita? Angelica said, as if reading my mind. It's entirely possible that he is protecting himself. It could be that he is enjoying this current situation and is determined to make sure that no one ends it. So, every time someone gets a little too close to learning Ghostlight secrets, he shows up, kills them, and then alters the Ghostlight image to cover his trail. I said all this with dawning rage and disbelief. How could they be doing something like this? How could anybody be so irresponsible as to tamper with forces like this with no idea of the consequences? In the 1920s, when X-ray technology was first being discovered, there was a company who was using a device that bombarded women's faces with X-rays in order to remove skin blemishes and unwanted facial hair. In time, thousands of women were disfigured and sickened by the exposure to absurd amounts of radiation. It happened because someone could make a lot of money very fast. I don't think it would be wrong to assume that this might be the case here as well. How can we stop this? This all has to end. That is the problem now, isn't it? Especially if we are to believe that Neil Kenny is not alone in his understanding of how to use the vortex towards his own purposes. Jesse looked at Ryan, who lowered his head. A conspiracy of ghosts. My mind was reeling at the concept. A network of spirits within the vortex concerned only with the protection and propagation of their further plans. Ryan was distant and troubled as he began to pace back and forth across the creaking floor. But what is their plan? I looked at Angelica, who was staring intently at Ryan's back as if waiting for him to speak. There would be only one way to find out, Ryan said as he stopped and turned to face us, his eyes locked on me. No way, Angelica said with a fierce, angry expression. He almost died, Ryan. What if he hadn't made it out? He'd be trapped in that ghost loony bin with psychos like Kenny. Maybe we can make it safer or something. We have to figure out how Kenny managed to pull him into the ghost light. Jesse was looking around the room as if trying to pull the answer himself from the air. Okay, Clay needs some rest, and we need some time to figure out exactly what our next move is. We're not going to just send our boy back in and hope he comes back. We'll make sure he's safe before we try anything. Ryan was fastening his goggles back on and walking towards the door. Get me some clothes. I want to go out, I said to Angelica as I moved to the side of the bed. You really need to, she started to say before I stood naked and began sweeping the room for my pants. I want out of this house and into the real world for a while. I need a drink and some food in a public place with real living people who don't have giant bird eyes. No offense, guys. Jesse smiled. None taken. Just be careful, okay? I will be as careful as humanly possible, I answered as Ryan handed me my blue work pants from a chair in the corner. Anyone ever tell you you dress like a factory worker? Ryan said as he eyed my garments critically. No, but my sister used to say I look like a repairman. Either way, you should let me take you shopping or something. That's all right. I'm at peace with my wardrobe, I said, smiling to Angelica as I buttoned my shirt. Now, take me to something fried, please. It was around 7:30 in the evening as we stepped from the gate and began walking down the back street from the Savannah House. The darkness was filled with a heavy, cool vapor fog that turned the street lamps into giant amorphous spheres of light. The street was all but silent. I could hear barking dogs in the distance and the dripping of some water source falling from a ledge or gutter as Angelica's silent gait was accompanied by the steady thump of my boots against the sidewalk. It felt so good to be there walking in the darkness, surrounded by the mist-veiled Victorian houses that loomed behind hedges and fences at our side. Every sense awakening, I was consumed by a new appreciation for the very condition of life. To be within a hurting, breathing, shitting human body is a state that most often I took for granted. The idea of wandering through a dream of memories, hopes, and horrors with no discernible means of gauging when one ends and the other begins was not the particular grand reward I envisioned for all the good people of the world. It was not hard to understand why the people of the other world which I had visited had so many issues with interacting with these spectral reminders that the universe was never wholly understood. People in general were so good at creating their own versions of reality, life, and death. Who wants some ghost mucking it all up with a stark and shocking truth? Life continues. You continue. But don't expect everything to make sense just because you die. I wondered how many suicides had blown their brains out only to find themselves standing moments later over the decapitated remains of their corpse with no escape, and every available human reaction, a thing of rage, loss, and sorrow. How would it feel to stand alone in that darkness of fear and misery with nothing but the knowledge that nothing had really changed, except that now there was no one to help or comfort you? So yes, it felt very good to be alive that night. We found a restaurant that served plates of fried chicken and mushrooms with a side of fried potatoes, and we commenced eating and drinking. I went through 3 glasses of wine while waiting for the meal to arrive. Angelica smiled at me with silent curiosity as I began to laugh and tell stories about my sister. I laughed until tears streaked from my eyes, and people at the other tables looked over with mild astonishment. I kept waiting for someone to ask me to leave or quiet down, but the crowd seemed content to let me enjoy myself, as if perhaps they sensed some need in me for release and joy. And that's when she told me they were married. I burst with merriment at the thought of my sister caught making love to her new husband at my dad's 70th birthday party. She didn't tell us because she didn't want a big wedding, and she knew Mom and Dad would insist on it. So I was like, why didn't you tell me? And she says, honestly, I didn't think you'd take care. And she was right. I was so wrapped up in my own life, I didn't even care. I was still laughing, but now the tears had begun emerging from a different source. I've spent so much time projected to that goddamn cloud that I've become just like it. You know, this is the longest I've gone without jettisoning into cyberspace in 5 years. I'm like a drug addict. Angelica, only people pay me to feed my addiction. My tone had become flat and low as I almost whispered across the table to Angelica, who stared at me with silence and pity. This whole sick, spiritually dead world is my enabler. And so I just keep going until someday something gives in my head and I either go crazy or I die of some aneurysm. And you know what really bothers me, Angelica? No, what? She said quietly as she gripped my hand. That this whole time, my sister might have been standing right there beside me, telling me what happened to her, and I wouldn't even have known. If it makes you feel any better, she's not. Ryan said that there weren't any spirits attached to you in particular. Some people have anywhere from 1 to 12 following them around. Wow, a whole entourage. I sat in silence for a moment until my plate arrived, and I gazed with amazing and wonderful hunger at the browned, crispy edges that steamed in the awesome and intoxicating aroma. Angelica smiled and covered her mouth with mild embarrassment as I began to devour the food unabashedly. After the meal was over, we left the restaurant and once more wandered the city, lost in a hazy world of unrecognizable buildings as we ducked into a dim, hidden alley. There, I lifted Angelica's dress and held her hips as she wrapped her bare legs around my waist and we made love against the damp, cold brick. In the fog, it seemed as if we only existed in a world now bereft of other life than our own. After, we walked slowly, giggling like children as we tried to find our way through the fog back to the house without the aid of a guidance system. It was then that the shadow leapt from the darkness, and I heard a slight hiss in my ear as some toxin was shot through the soft flesh of my neck and directly into my bloodstream. Angelica screamed as she was shoved to the street and kicked viciously in the stomach by some dark attacker. Waves of heavy sedation fell over me in a tide of narcotic sleep. I fought desperately to stay awake as Angelica held me in her arms and calling out to Ryan on her cell phone. They drugged him. I couldn't tell. I can't. He's already slipping. And slipping I was, deep into a black, endless night.